Okay, so in this stage we're going to be using a spotter brush, which is a really, sorry, I'm trying to get it here, a really tiny brush, and the one that I was using before. I'm gonna have to use I'm gonna have to use a mole stick. So basically a piece of wood that I'll use to help my hand stay on top of the canvas, or not touch the canvas. Now I'm going to start with painting Iris first. Iris first. I hope the colors are going to be mixing well. I'm painting wet on wet. So first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to lighten up this part of the iris, because the shadow that's falling from the top lid, that's really only affecting the iris on the top. At the same time, I have to be aware of all the details, such as how the iris meets or sits within the white of the eye. It's never a very defined line. I mean, it seems like it is, but it's not entirely sharp. Alright, so the edges of the eye are usually quite soft. And also the rim around the iris most of the time is quite dark in comparison to the inside of the iris. But that transition is quite soft. What you want to do when painting an eye, you kind of want to put some details that will show that you understand what the eyes build like, but you know, keep it smart. Like, you don't want to overdo it, because if you overdo it, I've seen people who are trying to do too well, or so they want to do it so well at painting an eye that they overdo it. It looks, I mean, some people say that it looks hyper realistic. I think it looks too realistic. Or it's trying to look too realistic. It's like you kind of see that it's not a real eye. Now in this particular case, the top of the eye is a little darker, and the reason for it is because the eye that I have as a reference is wearing a makeup. That's also a good thing to know, how to paint people wearing makeup. Notice how my whites or the white of the eye is not entirely white. I'm not painting it hyper white. That'd be a big mistake. You have to keep it darker. Sometimes it's better if it's darker than it is than brighter than it is. Too bright is kind of a clear giveaway that the artist does not fully understand the colors in the eyes. And it's quite tricky to an extent because the eye is both a sphere, so it's lit from above. It should have more highlights here, more shadows here. It's a very subtle thing. You can't overdo it, but at the same time there is a shadow from the top lid, so you kind of have a very little little space to indicate the shape of the eye. So you can't forget about both shadow of the object and the cast shadow of another object that's shining onto this object. And in this case it's a top lid. And as I said, you cannot forget that this, especially in lower eyelid, it's more prominent, and it doesn't really matter if a person has a makeup or not, unless they have one of those makeups that ends up painting the inside of the eye or eyelid. But generally, most women don't paint, or men don't paint the inside of the eyelid. Don't forget that the lower eyelid is usually, it has its own anatomy, because there's always some wrinkles, some bumps, mostly wrinkles, that shape it as well. It's really quite important to see those little details. Many people think that smudging or simplifying and making the skin look very, soft is a way to go. I'd rather do too many wrinkles than soften it too much, because, I mean, basically when you're painting someone and you try to make them a little bit too perfect, it'll show. if you want to flatter someone, you better find a different way to do that, basically, not by smoothing out the surface you're painting. There's always tiny, tiny little details on the skin. It doesn't mean you have to absolutely recreate every single wrinkle that you see or in the exact same place, but you can give the impression or paint it in a way that it's going to suggest that there is a certain type of surface, even if you don't paint every single line there is. In fact, you probably have a better painting if you don't. I personally, even though I really admire to an extent people who do hyperrealism, or some people are just in awe just from looking at the amazing rendering of each single strand of hair. I personally like art that's more loose and flowy, still realistic. You can still have a very realistic effect if you paint very loosely, or if you paint paint with broader strokes. I'll still go close up on details of the subjects that I paint. I just don't necessarily, as I said, paint every single strand of hair on their body. And I personally probably, if I were to choose whether I wanted to be more detailed or loose, because we all wish, even if we're good painters, or even if we consider ourselves good or quite good, we still have those I don't know, standards that we're aiming at. So for me, if I were to choose, I'd probably want to be more loose than more detailed and hyper-realistic. By all means, I actually think it's harder to paint loosely than to recreate every single dot seen on a high-resolution painting, but at the same time, I know it takes a lot of patience that I probably don't have to spend many hours recreating a photo and making it into a realistic painting. So by no means am I judging. I'm just it's my personal preference that I like to I like more flowy paintings. And also the fact that I'm saying don't go soft on certain parts of the painting doesn't mean forget about softness, because every painting should have soft and hard edges. Like, I'm going a little softer with the eyebrow, but mainly because I don't really want to spend too much time on it, and it's not the main focus of this sketch, so I'm on purpose trying to a little bit to soften it a little bit. So you can see I'm using a slightly bigger brush now, because there's no reason why those parts of the eye should be painted with tinier strokes. I'm gonna add some details in a minute that are gonna be you can achieve a lot with a brush that's technically a big brush. I can really make this brush separate and have big strokes, but at the same time I can make it be as gentle as I want it to be. Okay, back to a tiny brush. Look at how the tear duct, it never really ends abruptly in the eye. It's always a little tiny. It's like you can kind of see where it ends, but it's a very soft transition. And when you paint an eye, and especially if you aim at observing everything properly, then you'll see that it's a little more complicated than it seems at first. Remember that we all have some sort of freckles. I've seen paintings of people that didn't have a single freckle on their face. I've seen portraits of people where they didn't have a mole on their face. I've not met a person in my life who had absolutely no moles on their faces, maybe except for really small young children, but adults not so much. So observe and see, because those moles can sometimes decide on whether or not someone looks like themselves. Also be aware of what kind of surface you work on. I usually work on board, but every now and then I really like painting on canvas. Board has the advantage over canvas that, well, first of all, it's more sturdy and it's less likely to get damaged, either in transport or generally. But also, canvas, even though I really like the texture of the canvas, kind of reminds me of the romantic paintings, and I don't know, people associate the pattern with oil painting more than they do when they think of board. And I'm not talking about artists, I'm talking like regular people who, if they think about paintings, they're more likely to think of canvas. That's why so many digital artists, when they want to imitate an oil painting, they choose the canvas texture. You notice how I'm now only adding some tiny details to the skin. The photo that I'm working with has a lot of highlights. Mainly because I squinted my eyes when I was taking this photograph, and so I created those tiny little wrinkles that, because of how they were lit, also created this net of really, really light highlights. Kind of like it, that's why I'm recreating it. It's up to you. Sometimes if you leave something out, you don't necessarily have to copy everything that you see. It's up to you, that's why you're an artist. And every artist does that, a photographer does that. And sometimes in post-production, sometimes when they're choosing a shot, it's more favorable. Now I'm going to add some highlights. A couple that are quite important. One is the one that is in the eye. Just taking some titanium white. But not just titanium white, I'm using some titanium white mixed with umber as well, because the highlight is not all white. And then there's some highlights. One is a very fine highlight right over here. I'm just not going to make it completely white. Not all highlights are absolutely white. It's more about how they work with the rest of the painting. You can always add some white, you cannot, or it's harder to take it out. And there is one highlight, I don't know if I want to actually put it in, I'm going to try, I can always paint it over. There's this tiny little highlight. I have to be very careful how I put it in. Probably be all white. One that's right under the eye. It's probably just a bit of tear. And don't forget about shadows. Shadows have some textures as well. Not always and not a lot of it, but can make a big difference sometimes. It's exactly the same reason why I told you that you should pay attention and not flatter your subject too much. And observation is really important. As you can see, I'm not working on one thing all the time. And as I said before, it helps me, even with such a small little study, helps me to go from one place to the other. I paint a little bit of this, a little bit of that, and come back to a place that I neglected for a while, and then go elsewhere again. Generally, with any work of art, no matter what you're really painting, it's important to work on the whole piece, because one value can influence another, and you may find out that a piece or a part that you've worked on for a long time all of a sudden doesn't fit the rest. Still refining tiny little details, only because I kind of started with the details, now I'm going along with them. But the next thing that we're going to do is going to be eyelashes. And you gotta be kind of careful with eyelashes, because you don't want the eyelashes to look, well, before I do that, wait, I just noticed that maybe I find this part a little too distracting. I think it's a little too white, actually. Good example of something I didn't see straight away. Something that started bugging me a little bit. Okay, and now we are going to go and do eyelashes. Oops. Okay, so now we're gonna go to do the eyelashes, and we're gonna do it with burnt umber, without or hopefully without any added white. I hope I can keep this clean. Remember that each eyelash is different and they don't grow in the same direction. That's like one of the most important rules that some people forget about, especially when starting out. And because when you're starting out, you're looking for rules, and you think that there is a rule of painting faces, and sure enough, there are some proportions that are universal. There's exceptions from every rule, but if you learn, you have to know the rules, but it doesn't mean you have to follow them all the time. Like, for example, the rules of the proportions of the face. If you seriously treated them, you would have ended up painting every single portrait in the same way, and you wouldn't be able to recreate some really, really interesting faces that exist that just completely don't fall into all the rules of how faces are, what the proportions of the face is. They are more guidelines rather than rules to always follow. Don't forget there are some eyelashes at the bottom, but here I'll try to do some of them a little gentler, especially here. The ones at the bottom, there's never just as many of them as there are at the top, so be very, very careful how you paint them. Better not enough than too many, trust me. You don't want your subject's eyes to look clownish. Always remember about this gap. Don't be afraid to add some details if you think that it's gonna make the painting better. It's funny how you notice more and more details the more and more details you actually put in, because some details were not as important at the beginning. So you're focusing on something more important, and then once you're close to finishing the painting, oops, oh, there is something interesting. So this is it, a short study of an eye in oil. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope it's going to help you paint better eyes. Alright, so this is the final sketch. I hope you enjoyed the whole tutorial, and thank you very much for watching, and see you next time. Cheers!